All
Hello,
right.
everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast. What event logs? Part 2, Lateral Movement Without Event Logs. My name is Carol Auth of the SANS Institute, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speaker is Matt Bromley. He's a SANS Digital Forensic and Incident Response Instructor and a GIAC Advisory Board member. If during the webcast you have any questions for Matt, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Matt.
Awesome. Thanks, Carol. And hello again, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you're joining us from. If you are tuning in for part 2, welcome back. Happy to have you. And hopefully part 1 gave you something to think about, and we're back to learn a little bit more about how we can conduct investigations and how we can find evidence of attacker activity without these pesky event logs. As Carol mentioned, this is part 2 of a 2-part series where we talk about what event logs, what do we do, and how do our attackers get rid of them. If you have not seen part 1, it is archived, and there are links going to be provided available at the end of the presentation that you could use to track down part 1 and watch it if you'd like to take a look. I highly recommend, I don't recommend listening to me speak, but I do recommend listening to the ways that attackers are evading event log detection these days. But with that, let's go ahead and jump right into it. I'm really excited about this particular topic. All right, really easy agenda for us today. We got a quick follow-up from last week. We actually talked about a couple of things, and I had a ton of follow-up questions from folks over the past 7 days. And thank you to all those who reached out via Twitter, LinkedIn, email, and whatnot. Everyone brought forward some really, really, really great ideas. Everyone reminded me that I did not cover the full scope of event log auditing or event log messing with by attackers. And like I said, we're never going to be able to get the full scope inside of an hour, but there are certainly other methods that could be taken advantage of. But there is one particular piece that I wanted to follow up on that I got a lot of folks asking about. So we're going to talk a little bit about why lateral movement. We're going to get into how do we identify it. And then lastly, I'll leave some parting words looking ahead. How can we actually start to protect our environment knowing that event logs may not be available for us? What do I do when this primary source of evidence is no longer there? How do I deal with its absence? So few parting words at the end. All right, so let's follow up really quick to something that I talked about during last week's presentation. We brought up the capability of Mimikatz being able to actually patch the event log service as it's running. Being able to patch the event log service as it's running on a system and prevent any events from being written. This is a super scary feature because, again, it meddles with a primary evidence source. A lot of folks drop in a SIM, and the first thing they do is enable event log forwarding. And they go ahead and pipe those logs, and that's one of the first places that they look for. Mimikatz obviously gives us the ability to stop writing those logs, or gives our attackers the ability to stop writing those logs. One of the most common questions I got after walking through this was, is this particular patch persistent? Is it permanent on my system? Am I forever barred from seeing event logs once this happens? So I went and did some testing over the past week, and I really just took a look at the basic WEVT SVC file. Note, I don't have screenshots from the hashing and from all the other different cryptographic functions we could do, but just note that on the surface, after I applied the Mimikatz patch, this particular file, which we know is kind of the DLL backend of our event log service, did not get changed. Did not suffer a permanent change on the system. So it's likely that what's happening is a change in memory. If I can go back to the Mimikatz screenshot, note that it patches the event log service. It doesn't patch event log files. So based off of some really, really high level testing, really quick skimming of different file artifacts, I'm going to take a gander and say that this is not a permanent patch, and the files that are responsible for this, the code is not altered forever. Of course, you could always wrap file integrity monitoring around the System32 directory if you'd like, and see if there's any differences there. The other thing that I noticed as well is that if I rebooted my environment, event logs did start to show back up again. So not only is this file not patched, but it's not a persistent patch either. That lines up with what we see from a lot of attacker tools and a lot of capabilities. Mimikatz is not advertising permanent event log eradication or permanent event log destruction. It's patching a service in place. It's kind of an in-time patch that's taking. So to answer all of the questions that came through, note that it does not appear to be persistent. Now, of course, the answer is not reboot everything all the time, but the answer may be if you see Mimikatz and the system has not been rebooted since its execution, that may explain why you're not seeing event log entries. I wanted to address another point that came across from a lot of folks after last week's presentation as well. I am well aware that you could just wrap on Sysmon onto a system and tune things up all the way, and you would catch a lot of this activity. However, oddly enough, a lot of folks said their go-to advice when you don't have event logs would be to look at the Sysmon event log. Now, the irony of that statement is we're trying to imagine a world where event logs aren't necessarily my first go-to primary source. However, I will be the first person to agree with those folks and be an advocate of log as much as you can, utilize those endpoint monitoring tools, especially the ones that are free, and pipe those logs to another source. One key attacker failure, I pointed this out last week, and I'll say it again this time too. One key attacker failure that I see is they go after the system and the security logs, and usually the security, sometimes system does get a mention, but usually they leave it at just those two, thinking that will cover most of their tracks. You're right. It will cover your authentication. It may cover some IPs. It may cover a username or a domain that you're using. However, as I said, there's a lot of auxiliary logs available. And then when you get into robust, mature environments where they are running the Sysmons of the world, do have the endpoint monitorings of the world, without a doubt, they're going to catch that activity. So I don't know if I just told attackers to erase more logs, or hopefully the real takeaway was everyone go and get some endpoint monitoring in place. Make sure you're paying attention to these events as they come through. All right, well, let's continue though down our journey of what event logs. What are you talking about? I'm trying to imagine a world without this source, and how can I operate without having event logs at my beck and call? So first, let's talk about why lateral movement. Now, if you're looking at this slide and you're thinking to yourself, I do not need to have lateral movement explained to me, that's awesome. Hang tight for just a second. There are still some organizations who have trouble grasping the concept, and we want to make sure everyone is on the same page when we get into how to perform some sort of advanced analysis or incident response. We want to make sure everyone understands the terminology that we're using. That's another gap that I see happen quite a lot. Folks jump right into the most technical thing they can think of without really just, quickly setting the bar and making sure we're all paying attention. More often than not, when an attacker compromises your environment, they will not compromise the exact system that they want. Now, usually that is the case. I have been in some environments where the domain controller, the sole domain controller, is internet facing with RDP enabled, and that also happens to be the database server. I've been inside of some of those super compressed, non-vertical organizations where everything is in one spot and the attackers just get really, really lucky. Most mature organizations, though, do not exist this way. There is usually some sort of segmentation. There is usually multiple divisions, different subnets, different departments, hopefully different firewalls, different restrictions in place. It's not normally the system that they go after. So when we talk about lateral movement from an incident response point of view, we're talking about attackers moving throughout your environment. Now, lateral is not within a department. It's not finance, CFO to accounting. It's not CEO to executive admin. Lateral, in this sense, is moving throughout a network, throughout an enterprise. So technically, you could be moving laterally through multiple types of permissions, through multiple accounts. But when you think laterally, think inside of an enterprise. Think I'm moving across the various areas inside of one organization in order to get to where I need to go. And there's a few reasons why attackers need to do this. Well, if you compromise a system and it doesn't have the data that you want, you need to go find that data. Maybe you compromise a system and you get lower privilege credentials. You're going to try and move laterally to see if you can steal other credentials. You may have to steal them before you can move laterally, but you're definitely going to try. We also want to move laterally to maintain persistence. If I've got a system where I'm placing all of my attacker tools, I'm collecting my output files, I'm exfiltrating data to, and things like that, that system is more likely than not going to start getting alerted on. There's a lot of malicious activity going on there. So our attackers will often move laterally, and they'll drop persistence mechanisms in other places. Nice little red herrings some attack groups like to do as well. They'll cause a lot of commotion over here and let you detect over here and let you remediate and contain over here, and they're doing everything over there. And that's another thing we have to be careful about as well, and that's why it's important to understand that usually when you walk into some sort of organizational or enterprise breach, very, very rarely is it one system involved. Very rarely does that happen. Now, if it is one system, then you as the incident responder or you as the organization need to understand why that system gave the attackers everything they needed from square one. But that's the discussion for another day. This is a really, really straightforward example here. Again, you may have patient 0 that starts out in the HR department. Someone may send in a compromised resume PDF, a very common attacker technique. And just based off of what the attacker can discern about your network, they hop over to the finance department. Maybe they drop a shell there. From finance, they're able to catch an IP for the engineering, so they hop into the engineering subnet. They drop another persistence mechanism there. They finally get to where they actually want to be, which is the research and development subnet, so they can get all your IP, get your blueprints, understand what you're developing and what you're working on, and then exfiltrate that data out to the attacker site. A lot of times I see organizations either find patient 0 in HR and stop the investigation there, or I find folks catch the data on the way out, or worse, a third-party notification catches them on the way out. They find the R&D department and they stop there. They don't do any research prior to that. They don't look for that lateral movement. Notice if I start and stop at patient 0, or if I start and stop at the R&D subnet, my attackers still have reverse shells hanging out in finance and engineering. And logically too, a lot of organizations have trouble with this concept of, well, the HR department got compromised. That HR and finance are two separate things. They don't talk to each other. So therefore, there's no way the compromise would lead there. I'm going to break this down for y'all really simple right now. Your attacker does not care about the title of the person who uses the system. They do not care. Unless it's a sysadmin. Then they care. They want to know who that person is because they likely have privileged credentials. But if your attacker's jumping from workstation to workstation to workstation, they don't pause, find out who owns it, and then go to LinkedIn, do a little bit of research, and then celebrate because they're on the CFO's computer, or they're on the executive admin's computer, or they're on the accounting person's computer, whatever it may be. They are going after a particular goal, a data-based goal. Human titles, out of the way. It's the system that they're using. So again, this is why we want to be a little bit careful and understand that lateral movement is a key integral part to what our attackers do. Walk through a basic, and this is actually more frequent and more common as to what you're going to see in a lot of enterprise intrusions. This is modeled after credit card breaches, in which I work a wide number of. You'll have some sort of an initial compromise. Again, you're patient 0. Step 2 is the attackers, they're going to try and find the domain controller as fast as they can. They want those credentials as fast as they can. They don't want to hang around for too long. Very rarely, and I've seen it once, I've actually seen an attack group that compromised the system in March, end of March, and they didn't do anything until beginning of May. They went about a 5-week period of just complete stagnant, didn't do anything. We're pretty convinced that they sent out a phishing campaign and just got overloaded and weren't able to respond to all of their shells. But usually your attack groups will try and move as quickly as they can. Not only will they go after a domain controller, they're also going to find an additional pivot point as well. The domain controller likely is being monitored pretty heavily, so they're going to find another spot. Everyone here, or not everyone here, but folks who I talk to and work with a lot, I always ask, is there one system or a group of systems that is usually a central pivot point, meaning it can touch everything in the environment? Even folks who have an extremely segmented network that I talk to, and I say, my network is segmented. We don't share credentials. No system can talk to others, right? Everything is sequestered off. The card data environment can't talk to this other type of environment. And they're usually pretty good understanding of the network restrictions that are in place. However, there's malware on all these systems. So obviously there's a breakpoint somewhere. And I'll say, okay, can the domain controller talk to everyone? And the answer is usually no. We have good segmentation. There's different forests. The root is different. The way the domain is set up is correct. And then I'll say, okay, is there a log aggregator? Is there a system that serves as the SIM log aggregator that is touching everything via one port using the same shared service account? All of a sudden the color starts to drain because everyone realizes, oh yeah, there is one system in the data center of which we've opened firewall ports for every single subnet and every single segmentation that's there in order to collect event logs. I actually worked a breach 2 years ago, and the log aggregation server is what was open. The attackers had one port to use, and they had to use that port while event logs were being shipped across the environment. Didn't stop them. They were still successful in doing it. Once they found their pivot points and they found their persistence mechanisms, they're going to explore the various environments. Again, if you're going after and looking for card data and you're inside of a retailer or a hotel or a restaurant, you're going for the POS terminals. You're going for where the cards are swiped. Find that card data, drop in that malware, and then get that card data out of the environment. Sometimes you back up through the same exact route in which you're in there. Sometimes you have a direct exfiltration method. There's some card scraping malware that can exfiltrate over DNS, for example. Others just ship it right out over the wire. Others aggregate into output files. But we're not going to go too much into POS breaches. The takeaway here is that a normal, typical enterprise breach has lots of different touch points, lots of different types of lateral movement. This is why we need to understand and make sure that when we're doing an investigation, we are backing up as far as we can in order to know how our attackers move throughout the environment. All right, so now we've kind of covered the basics of lateral movement and why it's so important and crucial to investigations. Again, remember, very, very seldomly do your attackers get what they want on the very first system that they pop. So now let's talk about how we identify lateral movement. And again, we're living in a land without event logs here. We haven't talked about any event logs yet. We're going to try and see how much detail we can garner from our environment without having to look for the 4624s and the 4672s of the world or the 4720s of the world and just really quickly jump to the answer. We're going to have to do a couple roundabout methods. Despite being usually the best source of evidence of lateral movement, event logs are not the only source of evidence. And that's what we're going to talk about in this section right here. When I say best source of evidence, I'm not saying other evidence sources are not as reliable, and I'm not saying that they're not as good. However, event logs usually give you this nice, neat little package. Think about those 4624 log on events. It tells you the account, the IP, where they came from, who they're trying to log in as. It's all the data you want in one little spot. We may have to go through and pull those pieces from different areas. The nice thing about moving laterally is that it touches many parts of the environment, many parts of a system, as well as many parts of the overall environment. I like to use this example when I talk with a lot of folks, and I say, think about if you're driving a car in and out of a parking garage. Think about the process of parking in a parking garage. City folk who have a car, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Those of us who live in rural areas, parking garages are these things where they, no, I'm just kidding. I know you know what a parking garage is. Let's say I take my car in and out of a parking garage and I throw away the parking receipt. So there's no evidence. I pay with cash and I throw away the receipt. So there's no paper trail that I was inside of the car, or sorry, that I was inside of the garage. And then I also destroy the camera tape. So now you take away the capability of being able to say I have them on video, and you take away the paper trail that I entered and exited the garage and I paid a fee. So you take away some of those questions. But there's some things that I can't hide, right? I can't hide the fact that miles were put onto my car, that the distance of my car changed in between me driving into the garage and driving out of the garage. I can't change the fact that my tires suffered more wear and tear. I can't change that. The car has to move on tires. I can't change the fact that even if I drove half a mile, there was a little bit of change there that happened. I can't change the fact that car doors were opened and closed. If I go and park in a garage and I open a door, that creates a sound. That moves gears, that moves levers. If you've got a car with a lot of electronics, there's sensors and things that are set off. When I close the door, the same thing happens. There's levers and gears that are used in order to facilitate all of those functions that we take for granted. At some point of parking in the garage, I likely got out of my car to go do what I needed to do. And then at some point, I also got back in to my car as well. And the point here is to think about a really, really simple scenario, an attacker moving from one system to another, not complicated at all. But there is so much activity that happens around that event that takes place that you think to yourself, even if I get rid of that parking receipt and hide the video, there's a lot of stuff I can't change. There are things about doing an activity inside of an enterprise environment, inside of a computer or between two computer systems that you just can't get rid of. You cannot take away the fact that moving from one system to another involves the network. You cannot eliminate the network from that equation. So again, just ways to think about different artifacts that may be left behind. All of these various things that I cannot hide, that, if we translate this to my system breaches that my attackers cannot hide, these translate to points in time and items that I can trace. I likely got out of my car before I got back in. If I can find one then I can at least start to post-date the other. I know miles were added onto my car. If I can find the ending value, maybe I can backtrack to the start or vice versa. Okay, the first type of lateral movement we're going to take a look at is a combo of tools. Now, most folks have heard of PS exec. I'm also going to mention PA exec. And if you haven't heard of PA exec before, you're definitely going to want to check out this part, because PA exec is a really super interesting tool that seems maybe a little bit unheard of, but believe it or not, there's a lot of attackers that are taking advantage of it. And notice I'm kind of combining them two because they're very similar. All right, if you've heard of PS exec before, this is going to seem very familiar to you. If you have not heard of PS exec or need to brush up, just note that it is basically a remote management tool, part of the Windows sysinternals tool suite. It is actually quoted as a lightweight telnet replacement, but we all know it's just so much more. It has encryption built in. You can ask it to run scripts on different systems. It has automatic file copy execution switches. The reason why our attackers usually like it a lot is because you can run it against one particular target, or you can actually feed it an entire list of systems. You can actually create a text file or a file of any type, if you will, with line delimited hosts or IPs, and you can run PS exec against that entire thing. You can literally deploy your malware, kick off a one-line command, go grab a cup of coffee or grab lunch or whatever's being served in said Eastern European town that day, and come back and your malware is potentially deployed and you're done. You didn't have to sit there and manually do things one by one. Even better, you didn't have to import your own scatter tools either. You didn't have to import your own deployment tools. You just lived off of the sysinternals folder that the sysadmin left lying around. So that's PS exec. PA exec stands for Power Admin Exec. It's actually a PS exec derivative. One of the key points here is PS exec cannot be redistributed. PA exec can. And that is actually the foundation that created, or that spawned the creation of PA exec. They have many of the same exact features. They do mostly the same exact stuff. I'm going to jump back to our PS exec slide. If you take a look at kind of the command line parameters there, and then jump forward to the command line parameters for PA exec, they're not that far off in capabilities and differences there. PA exec looks a little bit different because I pulled it right out of the source code, but just note that they usually achieve the same types of functionality. PA exec is also open source. That is the key differentiator there. PS exec is not open source. It used to be, and there's a threat group that still utilizes the previous files from 2006. However, PA exec still is, which means attackers can take that code and they can wrap it inside of their tools if they want, or they can quickly compile on the fly. They can change the hash at a moment's notice if they need to. If anyone watching this works in any sort of financial organization or has dealt with a PCI breach involving Fin7, or a group also referred to Fin7 is the FireEye nomenclature, Carbonac is a little bit more common term, then you've likely seen this tool. This group likes to use PA exec, which I find funny because they actually leave more evidence than they realize in the environment. But we'll get to that in a second. But remember, PS exec, PA exec, two of the most common tools that we see our attackers use. Now, let's talk about what the here and the head and the there looks like. Let's say I am sitting on a local system and I want to run PS exec over there. I want to run PS exec somewhere else. The artifacts get changed a little bit. Note that it's not PS exec that gets dropped on the remote system. It's actually an executable called PSEXE-SVC. That is the executable, the single instantiated instance that gets created to do the bidding of whatever PS exec requested. That executable will not usually live on forever. It shows up, does its thing, and it pieces out, and it's done until the next PS exec invocation. Now note, the first piece of evidence I gave you is actually a system event log ID. The use of PS exec will create the PSEXE-SVC service on a remote system. Now let me drop in a quick caveat here. I'm going off of the defaults. If you know PS exec, you know full well that a lot of the artifacts on the PSEXE-SVC can be changed. But because it's an executable that does the bidding for PS exec, well, when an executable executes, we have evidence of program execution. We may also potentially have evidence of the commands that are run as well. So note, we're not looking at our event logs. Drop out that 7045. Now we're talking about evidence of program execution and command artifacts. Here's where it gets a little bit more interesting though. Now we're at PA exec. Remember, we're alternating between the two. PA exec looks like paexec.exe on the remote system. Very similar to psexec, no difference there. But check this out. Look what gets dropped on the remote system. I get a different file. I don't get paexec.exe. I get paexec-host-pid.exe. You may be asking yourself, host, what host? The host of the here system, the host that I am executing from. When paexec runs on a local system and it creates basically that little executable package that's going to be deployed on the remote system to execute, the package that gets created, it includes the host that it came from. So I have where you're coming from. I have evidence of where you're coming from on where you're going to. We'll take a look at that in just a second. And I also get the PID that you were using as well. Now, depending on the age, the PID may not be too useful, but regardless, I get things that intrinsically tie one system back to another. I'm not looking at event logs. I'm literally just looking at a PID in this case. We're going to talk about where we can recover this file from in just a moment. But that's a huge, huge piece of evidence right there. When an attacker uses a tool for lateral movement, part of the lateral movement artifact is the name of the host they're coming from in the executable. What an awesome threat hunting little piece of tidbit right there to look for. Again, going back to what if I work through this procedure and I'm at my here and my there, and I get my there tools, my PSEXE-SVC or my paexec. What if I take out the here? What if I take out not knowing where it came from? Well, I'm still going to get inside of paexec, but what about psexec? I don't really have that many artifacts, but the key takeaway that I want you to get from this slide is if you are doing incident response or system analysis and you come across the artifacts PSEXE-SVC or paexec or any other remnants of remote attacker activity, you are not looking at patient zero. That is the biggest point I want everyone to say. I'm going to say it again. If you find evidence of remote attacker execution, remote lateral movement, you are not looking at patient zero. There have unfortunately been times in investigations where someone has sent me a report on a system, and part of that report has included, oh, I found PSEXE-SVC. I close down the report software, usually Word, and I go to that person and I say, what is the other system? What other system? What are you talking about? Your investigation is not complete. Again, if you are looking at evidence of remote access tools, you are not looking at patient zero. You need to go and continue investigating and see where patient zero is. All right, so how do we track these down? How do I skip the event logs? And how do I look for evidence of execution? How do I look for particular artifacts that are going to tell me what exactly happened here? Well, again, let's focus on our evidence of execution first because our lateral movement tools drop executables on our system. The first place we're going to go is our shim cache. There is an entire presentation I did a couple years ago on shim cache. It's definitely available in the webcast, but let me just sum this up where if you're not familiar with shim cache, please go read about it after this presentation. Just note that it is Windows checking for operating system compatibility. It's actually a really, really awesome feature. Happens in the background all the time. Very, very few folks actually notice it. We're talking milliseconds of operation to sub in older code. Shim cache leaves us this beautiful artifact, which actually gives us evidence of program execution. We can use our shim cache data, and note at the bottom, if you're wondering where this came from, this is actually parsed shim cache output using Mandiant FireEye shim cache parser Python script. We can use that output to look for evidence of PSEXE-SVC being executed. Remember, our shim cache database points to evidence of execution. We get our true or false flags over to the right. So I've got here 6 instances of when PSEXE-SVC.exe was executed on the system. Each instance, remember I said earlier, PSEXE-SVC is a single instantiated executable that's created to do the bidding of the psexec command at the time. So every instance you have of PSEXE-SVC is an instance of lateral movement, is an instance of use of psexec. So in this screenshot right here, there is at least 6 times that my attacker has connected from one system to this current system. Now, there's nothing in here to tell me if they connected from the same to this one, or if they were coming from multiple points, I don't know. But I do know that I am not looking at patient zero. And because I've got shim cache data here, I can also look around, because it's sorted in order of execution. I can look around my executables and see what else was going on during my psexec time. Well, I have no clue what these odd-looking executables are. I know that executables like that usually shouldn't be sitting in the root of Windows. So I'm going to need to go and investigate and see what those are. And then take a look at after this ps exec activity here, I've got use of ipconfig, and then I've got another executable sitting in the root of C. So again, I didn't necessarily use this to tell me what system my attackers are coming from, but I used it to identify a point in time on my system when lateral movement was taking place. It was occurring because I can lean on what PSEXE-SBC is telling me. So now I've got more stuff to investigate. Maybe one of those will backtrack into a different piece of malware or something else that alludes to where my attacker may be coming from. Not only Shimcache, we can also go to our kind of other standard, our other bedrock of evidence of execution, which is our prefetch files. Remember our prefetch, which if you're not familiar with prefetch, it's basically a trace file for program execution. Windows monitors up to the first 10 seconds of execution, if it's enabled, of course, and it looks for what does your program do? What does it load while it's running? Can I optimize that code for you? Remember, some of these things were created back when we had spinning disks, right? Not everyone lived in Windows VMs in the cloud operating off of, well, now slightly inefficient Intel chips with tons of memory and SSDs and whatnot. But regardless, your prefetch files are going to give you things like the operating system, depending on the operating system version, you may get things like the run count. You may get things like the first and last execution. If it's enabled, your prefetch files are going to be in the standard prefetch folder. Note the key analysis here, though. We have a run count of PSEXE-SBC of 9. If you remember, in my previous Shimcache output, I only had 6 instances that showed up in my search. There are 3 more instances of lateral movement that I need to go track down. So again, I can use it as a tool to expand my investigation. I can use it as a tool to confirm I'm not looking at patient 0. And I've got a lot of lateral movement I need to go look for. Let's put that number into context. Let's say you come across a system and the attacker touched it via lateral movement one time a year ago and never came back to it. I'm going to take a guess and say there's likely either a good piece of malware on that system that is taking place of that functionality, or that system did not provide much use to the attacker. So they left it alone, didn't have what they wanted. Now I'm looking at a system that the attacker connected to 9 times. I've got multiple pieces of suspicious executables scattered throughout the place. You better believe there's likely something here of interest as well. If you're looking for PA exec inside of the prefetch, if you remember, I said earlier that your PA exec files are going to include the source system as well as the source PID. Because it's open source, I went ahead and threw in a screenshot of the source code there. But that particular prefetch file that you're going to find on the system is going to contain the same data. Even though it's an executable when it ran, the prefetch takes the name of the executable, and I know it throws a hash at the end of it, which is not in the text right now, but it throws a hash at the end of it, but you're going to get all that data. If you see evidence of PA exec in your environment, here's an awesome threat hunting technique. If you see PA exec in your environment, dump the prefetch directories from across your environment. You will not only find every system that was connected to, you will also find every system that your attackers were connecting from. Really, really awesome artifact there, but you're going to find the same evidence. And then, of course, I can also go to a memory image. Remember last week we talked about using memory image to find evidence of process manipulation, thread manipulation, things like that. Well, lateral movement using PA or PSExec is no different at all. If you have a memory dump of a system that you suspect had some PSExec activity, we can look for signs and strings. One of the first things that we can do is we can look for PSEXE-SBC processes. Remember, I'm just going to look for things like PSEXE, because if I find PSExec, PSEXE-C, I know I'm looking at a pivot point. If I find PSE-SBC, I know I'm looking at a system that was moved to. So that's important, and note the difference between the two. Now, if I see PSEXE-SBC on a system, likely I'm going to have some additional artifacts in memory as well. I can actually just dump strings from memory, and using volatility, I can actually map those strings to particular processes. And I'm going to jump ahead to our next slide here. I can map those strings out to particular processes, and I can line them up and see what other types of activity I'm seeing. Notice I do have a process 2100 inside of here, but I've also got a process 920, and I've got a lot of kernel space as well taking place. And sure enough, I've got some artifacts that look a little PA exec-y as well, right? I've got system names, WinXP 32-bit followed by a 4-digit number that's likely divisible by 4, therefore probably a PID. That's the easiest classification of PID I've ever said out loud, by the way. There is a much more detailed description of it. But just note that I've got some suspicious artifacts in memory that confirm the use of PSExec and confirm the use that I'm not looking at patient 0. If someone came from another system and is connecting to this one, I would obviously take that one system name, that WKS WinXP 32-bit. I'm going to take that back to my infrastructure and see, hey, what system is this? Is it the system I'm looking at, or is it the system, is it the system that they're coming from? So a lot of artifacts left in memory that we may want to go and track down. So that kind of sums up PA-exec and PS-exec. Again, two very, very common tools that are used for lateral movement to deploy things throughout an environment. PS-exec is definitely more popular than PA-exec for some odd reason. PS-exec is usually living off the land. Again, admins love to leave sysinternals all over the place so that they don't have to download them. We didn't even get into the discussion of registry keys. That's another topic. But just note that, I just covered really some surface artifacts that PS-exec leaves on particular systems. We're talking about lateral movement to and from. Let's look at other types of lateral movement, though. We're not just going to hang up on PS-exec or PA-exec. So one of the easiest threat hunting things I like to do, and one of the easiest incident response approaches that I like to do, is if I have a system that's, suspect of being compromised or something's happened, I will just pull up the user directory and I will go and sit with someone who knows that system, and I will say, are there any accounts here that don't make sense to you? Are there any accounts that should not be on this system whatsoever? Look through this list. Now, I don't know the environment. I'm called in usually as a third party to help in surge support or to help in a time of crisis. I don't know if these user accounts are good or bad, but the system admin definitely will say that person's not supposed to be on there, or that account is not supposed to be used in the past year. You're looking for unexpected, privileged, old, or decommissioned accounts. Now, what am I taking advantage of here? I'm taking advantage of the inherent Windows functionality that everything is tied to an account. If an attacker moves from one system to another, in certain situations, a full user profile will be created. When that profile is created, I get things like this. Imagine that. An incident response technique, an advanced artifact of lateral movement is the user folder supposed to be there? So I've actually had some success with this in the past, and I've had a lot of, there's a lot of system admins who look at the type of output and they say, that's wrong. These people should not be here. And we usually very quickly figure out what accounts are bad by going through this exercise. But now you may be saying, well, Matt, that's pretty simple. I will just delete an account from a system if I'm an attacker. Okay, no problem. I'm going to go back to my evidence of execution. I'm going to go back to my shim cache first. And I'm going to say, you know what? I know that there are some situations where an executable may run from within inside of a user folder. There are situations such as when I download something from the internet and I don't save to disk and then run from a location. I just click run in the browser. Or if I've got a suspicious executable that launches itself and hides inside of a temp folder or something like that. So the other thing that I may do is I may dump the shim cache out, and I can do this for one system or I can do it for 100,000 systems. And I'm going to look for every instance of a user folder. And I'm going to go ask the same questions of the environment. Are there any users that should not be on a particular system? Are there any users that should not be executing things whatsoever? One of my favorite combinations to see whenever I go through this exercise is domain admin accounts running executables from temporary internet files, from temporary internet locations. That is usually indicative that your domain admin is browsing the internet and or conducting personal or web-related activities from the domain admin account. Big no-no. So I don't want to be the compliance cop, but this is a good way to find out what your what your employees may be abusing their accounts for. But I'll take a look at this list. Remember, I'm not looking at event logs. I'm not looking at a system. I'm not looking for attacker activity. I'm looking for things that don't fit. I'm looking for things that don't make sense. If I'm looking at one system where I have suspected lateral movement, though, then I'm going to dump one system and say, what account doesn't belong on here? What account doesn't make sense? Look for those user-specific executables. I can do the exact same thing for prefetch as well. I can go dump and parse the entire content of a prefetch folder on a system. And I can look for the same exact type of data. Notice though, because it's a prefetch, I'm not going to necessarily catch I may catch the executable name, but I'm also going to catch things like supporting DLLs. I'm also going to catch things like supporting files that were loaded or extracted at runtime. They may not have lived on the system prior to the initial first couple of seconds, but I'm going to get things like the context of the user account that was used to run them. This is actually by the way, all of these screenshots are from the exact same system. I'm looking at multiple user accounts, multiple types of prefetch data that was captured inside of these environments here. So a lot of really good sources that I can use to identify evidence of lateral movement, evidence and use of accounts that shouldn't necessarily be on a system. Now, let's talk about, all right, so I find a compromised account on a system. What did that user do? Did that user move laterally to anywhere else? You know, now we're looking at the from part of the equation, not the to, but the from. Well, another thing that a lot of attackers don't know, and quite frankly, a lot of system admins don't know either, is a lot of your RDP activity. So we're jumping to RDP as a lateral movement technique. A lot of your RDP activity is stored inside of the Windows registry. The username that you used. A lot of folks like to be prompted with their username. They don't want to have to type that in. They just want to type in their password. The Windows system remembers that for you. It will also remember the IPs that you connected to. So some information is stored in the registry. You're also going to get some of this information stored inside of jump lists as well. If you've used basically a Windows 7 or above system, Windows 7 and above, depending on the different settings that are on there, you may be used to jump lists as well. You may be used to jump lists, which, as I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with, all you do is hover over a particular executable. You hover over Microsoft Word, you hover over Microsoft Excel, and it brings up the list of the 10 most recent documents that you had opened, or the 10 most recent spreadsheets, and allows you to access your history that way. RDP is no different. RDP also maintains information about your historical remote connections, and it gives you the opportunity to quickly reference them if you'd like to. Guess what? More evidence that's stored on the system. I've actually worked a case, I want to say about 3 weeks ago, where jump lists were a key feature in determining where an attacker was moving to and from. They were clearing event logs. They thought they had that part covered. What they were not clearing is the 4 systems that they kept cycling between using RDP. Every time they would RDP, they would clear event logs, but they would also create more artifacts inside of the registry. So you may think you're being slick when it comes to hiding some of these different artifacts, but just note that there's usually a lot of stuff still there that we will find. Another very, very common lateral movement technique that you see a lot of threat groups use is also the use of scheduled tasks. If you're still flirting with the Windows XP environments, then you're familiar with at.exe. Vista and above, we're now familiar with scatasks or shatasks, or obviously the shorthand version of scheduled tasks. Look for evidence of at and shatasks in your evidence of execution resources. So again, your shimcache, your prefetch, your mcache, recent files, so on and so forth. These files create different types of specific artifacts. Shatasks creates an XML schema, version 1.2. At.exe creates job files. Both of these executables are still supported. At.exe is technically deprecated, but still works, still runs. And you're going to find these located in a couple of different paths, the different schemas and or job files. Again, more artifacts that I can parse to identify what you've been doing as you've been interacting with a system, as you've been trying to create some persistence mechanisms, or more importantly, the focus of today, as you've been moving laterally. I'm going to get evidence of that inside of these different job files. Remember, scheduled tasks do have their own event logs, but we're trying to live outside of event log land for now. But if you have those available, those were not cleared or removed, you can go take a look at those various pieces of evidence. At the bottom, there's actually a screenshot of an XML task schema. This is the version 1.2. And notice that it includes a lot of information inside, such as various DLLs, the task name, different sources, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of things you can pull out of that in order to understand more about what your attacker may be doing. Now, it's going to differ upon your environment. I would sometimes say scheduled tasks is not the first place you're going to want to go. Usually because there are a lot of inherent Windows system tasks, and sysadmins love to use them, and it can get very noisy very, very, very quickly. What you want to do instead is, one, understand what you may normally do. You know, sysadmins, do you use at.exe? No, I do not. Okay, I'm going to look for job files. Versus the opposite. You know, do you guys use shatasks? No, we do not. I'm going to look for evidence of that execution scattered amongst other suspicious things, I may have evidence of lateral movement there. But again, another common technique that a lot of groups like to use. Can't talk about lateral movement without focusing on, of course, WMI or PowerShell. I'm assuming everyone's familiar with one of these two, if not both concepts. I know our attackers are, which means we need to be as well. And of course, because they're built in and they're understood by Windows systems, they're used for management instrumentation and the built-in Windows command line and all those various features. Obviously, our attackers love to go this route. There is, of course, a whole field of research built into both red and blue team PowerShell tactics as well. So just note that this one slide is going to merely skim the surface. But what I want you to take from this slide is, on my local system, I'm going to run WMIC or PowerShell.exe. Yes, there should be a dot in between that shell and exe. I'm going to run those. On my remote systems, very similar to PsExec or PAExec, I'm going to have different executables being dropped. Again, I could go to my evidence of execution and I could look for these happening. Remember, we're talking about remote specific operations. So very similar to finding PsExe SVC. If I find something like WMI PRVSC or WSM Prov host, you may be leaning on that artifact and saying, I am seeing evidence of remote activity. I'm seeing evidence I am not looking at patient zero. And again, we're trying to stay out of event log land, but if you tune up PowerShell event logging and module and script blocking and whatnot, you're going to have a lot of that evidence captured in there as well. All right, so that really wraps up. It's not a complete comprehensive list, but I'm going to call it a common list of techniques that I'm seeing attackers use really on a daily basis. PowerShell, WMI, and PsExec are probably the three most common. However, scheduled tasks definitely do have a very, very wide market share. And then, of course, PAExec, as I said, is limited usually to particular types of threat groups, but we may see its usage grow in the future as well. Looking ahead, though, how can we live better in an event log list land, or how can we plan to never live in an event log list land, if you will? Again, despite being one of the best sources of evidence, event logs are not the only. Moving laterally, or really any attacker activity, touches so many parts of the environment that you're very likely not going to go completely untraced. Windows relies on accounts to do everything, and accounts leave a lot of footsteps. They create a lot of noise. Accounts are always the bull in the china shop. They are always making noise somewhere, doing something, dropping here, dropping registry keys, creating files, creating folders, whatever it may be. Know the implications of the footsteps that you're coming across. Again, if I can give you all the biggest takeaway from this presentation, it's knowing that if I am seeing evidence of remote activity, you have at least one more system to go look at least. So if I see foo, that means I'm seeing bar. Another important takeaway here is to know your environment. I talked earlier about looking at things like user accounts on systems, user accounts inside of execution. I need your team to be familiar with these different concepts. If you're a manager of an IR team or of a SOC or something like that, please make sure you give your team the time to understand and baseline their environment. I'm not saying everyone needs to have the entire structure memorized and be able to recite it like the 15-year-long sysadmin who's been there. But if I walk into your environment as a third party and I'm there to help you, the first half of our day should not be trying to figure out who the domain admin accounts are and how many domain controllers you have. You need to know this stuff way ahead of time. I don't care what format you keep it in. Put it in a notepad and keep it available for folks, but keep that information available. Obviously, don't keep it in a place that your attacker is going to, be able to use it to perform recon on your system. The best answer to avoid an event log list world is log collection and forwarding. You can't, it's hard to get rid of it if you're placing it in so many different places. Attackers cannot erase everything. As I've mentioned multiple times, they usually go after one or two different types of event logs. Very seldomly do they clear the whole board. You've got other ones you can go after, but if you're doing some of that real-time forwarding, it's only going to be the advanced tools, the invoke phantoms and the mimikatz that are really going to kill your event log forwarding. You're still going to have them. Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about event logs are not always necessary. We can usually put the pieces of the puzzle together without the event logs. We've got additional artifacts. Anyone who's worked a case where event logs have rolled knows that they're not always that crucial. However, they may be the final 10 pieces in that 1,000-piece puzzle. They're not going to distract you from seeing the overall picture, but it's going to be those couple corners that you don't have, or those edges, or that one piece in the middle, just that one little piece you couldn't find out. So This is not meant to say they're not necessary. In fact, quite the opposite. They are an extremely good and necessary artifact. Note, they're not 100% necessary to do an investigation, but they sure as heck make it a lot easier, and they give you much more visibility. So with that, brings us to the end of part 2, what event logs, talking about lateral movement and the use of event logs in investigations. With that, everyone, thank you. If this is, if you attended both part 1 and 2, thank you for attending both. If you just attended today, this presentation, when it's posted up for archive, will have a copy to the previous webcast in there. But with that, thank you all for joining. And Carol, I will hand it back over to you.
All right, thanks, Matt, for that great presentation. We do have quite a few questions ready for the Q&A. However, if anyone has a question for Matt, please enter it into the questions window now. Last time you mentioned that one of the methods of attackers would be to stop the event log service. In my experience, even an administrator does not have the permission to stop the event log service. Is that correct? Any tips how to spot event log service tampering?
Yeah, so not only last week, not only did we mention stopping the event log service, but I also walked through a couple ways that can be done. You're right. It does usually require elevated privileges, and there may be some additional system tampering that takes place on there. So I won't agree 100% that it can't happen, because we obviously saw evidence of it happening. However, I will agree that it does require a good level of privileges to do that. So a couple ways to detect kind of that tampering. As I mentioned last week, whilst we're trying to think about an event log list world, your endpoint monitoring, things like again, I'm gonna continue to tout Sysmon because it's such a useful tool. Getting that visibility, that granular visibility on your systems, looking at those additional logs is one way at the host level to look for those types of things. Another way is, one of the things I mentioned last week, is looking for gaps in timeframes on your systems. So if you've got a domain controller that's forwarding logs, for example, and then all of a sudden on Monday at 10 p.m., between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m., it stops forwarding logs, but the system was on, look for some of those time-based anomalies as well. Look for periods in time when events stopped shipping. So I'd say a couple different ways. Look for attacker activity on the system. Look for event logs not showing up. Fire an alert if this system stops reporting. But let me just sum up all of that with, you are right in that the person who asked the question is correct in that it usually requires an advanced level of privileges to occur. Usually when you are on a system, and if you're an attacker and you've got those advanced privileges, you've achieved the ultimate within an environment, and you have the capability to impact some of this damage or impact event log services. That's likely not the first thing you had to do. There was likely a lot of other steps that took place prior to you getting there. So someone stopping or removing event logs from an environment, if they've got the privileges to do so, they've already done a bunch of other activity up until that point. So I would say look for that activity as well, and know the tools that can impact these services. So that way look for those tools and their capabilities as well.
All right, thanks, Matt. I want to let everyone know that I have put a link to part 1 into the chat window just now. Matt, you may have covered this. So what are good ways to detect anomalous movement, unusual net flow host pairs? And they say, for example, it sounds like, why is host X in corporate suddenly communicating with server Y inside the data center?
Yeah, no, that's actually the answer I would give. One slide I intentionally did not cover in this presentation was network traffic. And I just want to note, I mentioned very early on, all of this activity traverses the network. Everything that we see has to happen over the wires. So yes, without a doubt, one of the best and constant, consistent resources you'll find for lateral movement activity is going to be at your network traffic. I tried to keep it host-based for this presentation, but there is, definitely another hour we could talk about lateral movement across the network. And the example that the question gave is right along the lines of things that you should be looking for as well inside of your environment. Just to think of a list of, common anomalies that you may see: workstations talking to workstations, departments talking to departments. Earlier I gave an example of HR jumping into finance. Why is the HR recruiter RDPing into the CFO system, right? Things like that just don't make sense whatsoever. And those are really easy 3389 alerts that you can drop in. Networks that are segmented that should not be talking to each other. is, another anomalous one you can look for. The domain controller RDPing into various places, or the domain controller with very odd activity, right? Domain controllers will typically have a lot of communication with your environment, but it's usually over very specific ports. You can wrap alerting around basically all the other ports, right? Why is my domain controller 3389 active? What's happening here? They'll help you find bad hygiene as well as potential attacker activities, or even better, they may help you find holes that an attacker would take advantage of, but no longer has to. But yes, the importance of network traffic cannot be understated when identifying lateral movement. So thank you for that question and the associated example.
All right, so Matt, this next one I assigned your name to it, so it should show up in your chat window because it's got a lot of, I might mispronounce some things. Since PA exec is open source, could an attacker change it so that it leaves a different exe name than PA-EXEX-host-PID-exe style name?
Yep. Yes, they definitely could. And that is an important thing to note as well, is again, the default PA exec file name leaves the system as well as the PID in there. But yes, because it's open source and because you can download the source and compile it yourself, you could just as easily take those parameters out and name it whatever you want. As I mentioned when we went over that slide, I was going off of the defaults for PS exec and PA exec. It's important to note here, you can also change the remote name for PS exec as well. It doesn't have to be PSEXE SBC. So yes, the remote counterparts of these remote tools could easily be changed and manipulated and modified, some easier than others, obviously, but without a doubt, that is certainly could be changed. Now, I think the follow-up point to that is, does that change how I detect and how I look for some of that activity? Potentially. But remember, remote access or lateral movement is always a two-part equation. If you're going to change kind of where you're going to, but you don't change where you're coming from, that I still have a standard signature I can look for. If my attacker changes both elements, right, they change the name of PA exec as well as the output file that they're connecting, or the remote file that's being created, they're changing both of those, well, then I can go back to my network traffic. Why do I have these two systems talking to each other, pushing executables over the wire, so on and so forth? So yeah, plenty of other different points that can be looked at, but short answer is yes, an attacker could change those if they wanted to.
All right, thanks, Matt. Why is the IP config entry date 3 years different than the rest on the shim cache slide?
Okay, so really good question, and this falls into knowing our artifacts. One of the things to note, and I'm actually jumping back in the presentation if anyone has seen their screen flutter really quickly here. Shim cache, and again, this is definitely another hour-long presentation that I've given before. However, shim cache on the surface records evidence of program execution, but when that execution is recorded, it records the modified timestamp of the file. So for most of the entries in this system, it does look like we have a pretty consistent time frame, which we may be able to pivot off of. You can't say that with certainty just yet, but the reason IP config looks like it's 3 years earlier in history is because its modified timestamp is July 14th, 2009, which is likely the last time it was modified and then put inside of a Windows ISO and dropped out. So that's why the timestamp is different. It's because of the timestamp that the tool imports and inherits.
All right, I think we have time for just one more. How did you get the order of execution in the shim cache parser output? And in parentheses, they say IP config dash second enlist first in modification time.
Yep. So again, the modification time is pulled in. Looking at this particular slide here, shim cache data is stored again in order of execution with the most recent executable at the top. So if you're looking at just this slide here, if I'm looking at the history of this system, the oldest execution on the system was that TOP LZAGU that was executed the furthest time ago. The most recent execution was DLL host.exe inside of the root of C. So shim cache data you kind of read in reverse. You start at the bottom and you read up in order to get closer in time. That's how the order of execution works in that particular artifact.
All right, Matt, thank you. Before we close out, I wanted to let everyone know that any questions not answered during this webcast can be submitted to q@sans.org. And Matt, I'm not sure if you put contact information in and I missed it, but That's one way.
I do have some contact information in the very first few slides, and then
Okay.
I'm going to amend this the last page for you, Carol, and drop contact information there as well.
Okay, sure. And by any chance, Matt, do you know when your Slim or Shim Cache presentation was? I was pointing people towards the archive, but if we have an idea of when that happened, that might help. But
I want to say sometime in the summer of 2015.
oh, okay.
But I could track it down, and I can provide that link in there as well.
Okay, all right, thanks. All right, well, thank you so much. All right, wonderful. Thanks so much, Matt, for your great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast. And Matt, last thing, you've got a lot of great positive feedback. Have a great day, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone, for watching.